treating the real economy in such a way that we're getting less out of every unit of land and water. In the process, we're poisoning ourselves and the earth, and in the process, we're providing far fewer jobs.
Local, a simple concept with the potential to change the world. This conversation has been one of the most anticipated conversation amongst our audience, who have, many of our audience have witnessed the centralization of power viscerally over the last couple of years and the impact that it's had. And we have a shared desire to see some decentralization of that power and wealth and the way that the world is governed and shifts in the economic systems. Now, one of the most powerful ways that that type of decentralization can indeed occur is through localization. And I'm delighted to be joined by Helena Norberg-Hodge today, who has been for the last 45 years working on initiatives to support the localization of the economy and to play a part in transforming the world around us. Today, we're going to talk about how some of the recent issues, such as the pandemic and now the war, has accelerated the need for this type of change, this type of systemic change, and look at some of the macro and micro levels. One of the things that I've most profoundly been impacted by through Helena's work through Local Futures is the big picture activism and what that means to us when we look at how we can play a part in creating change. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Helena today. She's really a pioneer of the new economy movement. She's a founder and director of the international non-profit organization Local Futures and covenant of the World Localization Day, which is coming up later this year. So Helena, absolutely delighted to have you with us here. I feel like this type of conversation is there's no better time to be having this type of conversation.
I agree. I wish it had started earlier, but it's definitely needed now, and very happy to be here.
Yes, well, I agree. I think you've been working on this longer than I've been alive. So let's, if we may, I would love to just take a few steps back in terms of what inspired you. I know you had a unique story that led you to the work that you're doing now, but your story has inspired countless others. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about what was your tipping point to entering into this work.
Yeah, well, the tipping point was definitely having the almost unique opportunity to get to know a culture that hadn't been affected by either colonialism or economic development. And that was a place called Ladakh. It's actually part of India politically, but is culturally and geographically part of Tibet. High up on the Tibetan plateau, at about 12,000 feet, was this sort of Shangri-La that no one had heard of in the mid-70s when I was asked to go out there as part of a film team. And now, even today, it's remarkable. It's still rather unknown, which is quite a good thing, because it is very much, it's Tibet. And in many ways, it's more Tibetan than Tibet because it hasn't been quite as overrun. The overrunning in Ladakh has been mainly tourism and conventional development. But what happened was that basically here people had evolved in one of the most difficult environments on the planet. It's 12,000 feet and it's a desert, and with very deep, careful adaptation to a very, very difficult environment, minus 40 degrees in the winter, only 4 inches of rain a year, and so on. This deep adaptation to that specific ecosystem had allowed them to create a standard of living that was remarkably high. The houses were large and they were essentially adobe or mud brick, but often 3 stories high, sometimes 4 stories. There were monasteries, as many will have seen, the sort of Tibetan monastery. Well, there were lots of those, up on hills, gleaming white and hung with, beautiful carved balconies, as many of the farmhouses also had. It was not, of course, the wealth and the comfort that we have in the West, but there was no poverty, there was no unemployment. There was also, after 500 years of peaceful coexistence between a majority Buddhist culture and a significant number of Muslims, there had never been group conflict. they didn't know a word for things like depression or suicide. And I, as a linguist, I had myself, I'm Swedish, but English, German, I had lived in many different countries. I had learned quite a lot of languages, become a linguist, seen a lot of the world. Um, and I was asked to go out as part of this film team to pick up a bit of the language to help make a German documentary about this remote, unknown culture. I ended up learning to speak the language fluently fairly quickly, and in the process just fell completely in love with these people. These people were the most equanimous, the most sort of light, the most humorous, the most vital, joyful people I had ever met. So I ended up staying on when the film was finished, and by that time I had become passionately involved in trying to bring information to the Ladakhi people about what all this development actually meant that was coming in, because they, unsuspecting, knowing nothing about the outside world, were suddenly being sort of essentially psychologically polluted by images of an incredible life where it looked like in this dream world of America in the West, people didn't need to work, they had these incredible amounts of money, and it looked like it was a life of constant leisure and lots of money. So it was very seductive for young people. And anyway, I won't make, I better not belabor this story too much. I could talk about it endlessly. I would love people to look at my book, Ancient Futures, where I describe that ancient culture that by that time I had lived there over a 16-year period for roughly half of every year. And I had witnessed this contrast between the old and the new. And that was an absolute, turning point very early on, because it was so clear that was what was being brought in, among other things, was a development based on fossil fuels. What was being brought in was DDT, which had been outlawed in the West, asbestos, which at that point had also been outlawed, but they were constructing a hospital with asbestos. So it was so clear that there was such a need for better communication between remote, rural, land-based or indigenous cultures and the modern world. And that's what I became, sort of an ambassador between those two worlds. And I was coming back very early on also to the West to say, wait a minute, wake up. This thing called growth, called progress, called development is actually continuing to tear apart the fabric of community, to tear apart our deeper sense of connection to one another and our connection to the natural world. We're being shredded, and we are still blindly supporting many of the mechanisms and tools that bring about that breakdown. And with it comes not only a massive increase in pollution, and with that, massive increase in cancer and other serious illnesses, heart disease, all these things were basically didn't exist in Ladakh in the early days. But very clearly and very dramatically, what it brings with it also is depression from the isolation, the loneliness, the uselessness of being engaged in work where you have no idea what the impact is, no idea what your role is in this world. We've been removed from meaningful occupations. We've been removed from the richness that comes from living much more in the here and now, which is something that most wisdom traditions, most spiritual teachings have been trying to teach for a long time. But what has happened, unfortunately, in the West is that many of the wisdom teachings were taken, picked up, but applied in an individualized way with no understanding of the structural implications. No understanding, I shouldn't say no understanding, but generally that was missing. So That's a bit of a beginning. I have a lot of
Yes.
territory.
So, well, absolutely. So, what I'm curious about, you've actually described quite vividly the kind of experience that you had of a very different culture to what perhaps we were climatized to here in the kind of developed West. When you were exposed to that type of culture, did you have a kind of aha moment that kind of could you see a path to create a bridge between these types of culture, or did that take a little longer to emerge?
I very early on became aware of the need for decentralization, which I called it for many years. And it was also with the help of a book called Small is Beautiful by the economist E.F. Schumacher. Now, that book didn't really so much affect my thinking, but it affirmed everything that I had seen and experienced. And it did it from, an established male economist with relatively high status. So that book gave me the courage to speak out more loudly and, above all, to write to the Indian government and to say there is another model for development. There is another way that people around the world could actually have a bit more comfort, some tools and technologies that would actually serve society's interests, serve humanity's interests, but not be linked to the profit making of distant corporations and banks. And that would clearly be based on decentralized renewable energy. And there's an important conversation to have now between the sort of decentralized renewable energy path that people like Schumacher and I were promoting in the 70s, and most of the environmental movement throughout the industrialized world were very, very clear about the need for that. But what we need to talk about is how the influence of global monopolistic corporations have influenced our thinking so that today's Green New Deal is something quite different. And we need to urgently, I'm glad that you liked big picture activism, because for me, big picture activism is all about what's in our heads. That's what's the most important issue, to just pause a bit, to think about, to have a more holistic, a more global, a more honest look at what is going on in this world. Why are we hurtling from crisis to crisis? Why is it we can't trust any information anymore? What is going on? Well, I think we in my organization and my network, that we have a quite a lot of clarity, information, vision based on experience at the grassroots in numerous countries. And that experience, I think, is what we need to share now, and that I hope that people will want to share and to focus more on countering the propaganda that has been put out with the help of corporations. That no need for more talking, don't need it. People don't learn from information. No. That's this patriarchal top-down system. Absolutely get rid of that. Let's not have any of these white males talking at us. Let's get on with the action. And we've had a narrowing of vision and this focus on action, which has been a narrow treatment of symptoms. And that is what reinforces systemic escalation, just treating symptoms.
Oh, just music to my ears hearing that bit, because that is personally one of my highest frustrations, because the problem I witness when you focus on the the symptoms level rather, is it becomes very myopic. You don't consider the holistic picture. You don't understand the second or third order consequences of your actions. It requires some integral thinking in order to understand the intricacies between economies, politics, citizens, the planet. It's so complex but we live in this world where everything is just reduced down to this level of simplicity, which makes things perhaps easier to understand, but it doesn't actually help us to take informed action that can lead to sustained change.
Yes, and I would actually say, I wouldn't say that it helps us to understand, because it actually ends up blinding us to the
Yes.
understanding we need of what's actually going on.
Yes, and we also get stuck in that, and this is something I've experienced personally, but kind of the urgency of a situation takes us straight into, battle mode where we try to fix something,
Exactly.
and we never
Yeah.
come up. Then, if we're constantly chasing that, we're never then coming up to breathe and looking at the horizon, looking at the big
Yeah.
picture, thinking strategically, always operating tactically, and
Yes.
that's actually physically for a human being, it's stressful being in those environments. But we get caught then in short-termism, which is
Yes.
part of the problem itself, in my view.
Exactly. And this is also so important that we stress this, because in the sort of spiritual movement where people have understood the need for an inner calming, have learned from the East very often, and often from more ancient cultures, not only in the East, the power of slowing down or even shutting down the chattering mind in order to let ourselves relax and be the way we've evolved to be. We have overdeveloped the left brain, become over intellectualized, and now we're in a situation where we need to rest, we need to breathe and become more human again. But unfortunately, in the spiritual movement, their discussion of consciousness is only limited to that dimension. And what we're trying to talk about here is the consciousness of the bigger system that has come to dominate. And this is also about consciousness, but it requires a fair amount of left brain activity. But it needs to be left brain activity guided by a deeper and essentially by cultivating a more holistic approach and being willing to step back and just breathe and say, okay, we're going to look at this. We're not going to be afraid of looking at the global economy because it's so big and it feels like some kind of evolution. Well, people don't even think of the global economy as being evolutionary, but what they do is they treat the symptoms of the global economy as some kind of evolutionary progress that's inevitable. And that's happened with the help of people like Yuval Harari, who I think is very well intentioned, but unfortunately, his entire message has reinforced the idea that techno-economic development is a type of evolutionary inevitable path that we can rather, sort of reluctantly, but still we have to adapt to it. So there's been very, very little vision and holistic information in the landscape for almost exactly the period that global corporations have been given more and more power to dominate our governments. And that's been roughly since the mid 80s. And I would argue that since the late 80s, early 90s, there's been a closing down as every avenue of knowledge has been colonized by big money. So that includes the internet, it includes school books for children even, it includes the rendition of history, it includes how gender, how race, how the environment is being framed and discussed. All of this is colonized by big money, which we also learned in that film, the what was it called, the Dilemma film on social media.
Social dilemma. Yep.
Yeah, the social dilemma showed how algorithms, these blind robotic organisms, have realized that polarization, divisiveness, violent conflict is profitable. Now, this I'm saying very loudly and I hope clearly. I have witnessed this polarization in the mainstream media, not just in the social media. And where I first became, very aware of it was in Sweden, which till this day is held up as a relatively benign form of this system that's engulfing the planet. But unfortunately, in fundamental ways, Scandinavia has gone along with the systemic path that is what I see as responsible for most of the crises we face. And that is the globalizing path of the economy, which has been supported by trade treaties since the Second World War, but a new incarnation of real, treaties where governments were signing in black and white, we won't do anything that will threaten your profit, to big corporations of every kind. And we're talking now also about the corporate side of the war machine. We're talking about banks. And we're talking about things like after 2008, when the whole world became very aware that it was crazy to allow youngsters in pinstripe suits to sit in front of computers and speculate on our lives, the value of our currencies, the value of our mortgages, the values of our democracies. It was so clear that this financial casino needed to be regulated. But instead, we were told, too big to fail, and instead, our taxes were used to bail them out. So I'll just say one more thing quickly before I let you speak. There's a lot of discussion at the grassroots now, particularly about the UN and about Agenda 21, and also about the World Economic Forum. And of course, a lot of talk about Bill Gates and his role. But I think it's vital that we understand the bigger picture, because it isn't only, Davos per se has not been an instrument of implementation. That has been where the sort of leaders, economic and political leaders, have met. And Agenda 21, and I'm trying to think of some of the other things that are often now sort of people are looking at, but they're not looking at the trade treaties that were the mechanism that gave these corporations and banks so much power. And the reason why governments, instead of regulating, as they should have done after 2008, were doing the opposite, literally subsidizing. And are you okay if I say just another couple of things about
Please,
that?
yeah. This is so important. It's also relevant. So please carry on.
Yeah. So what we've been witnessing in my networks, and in fact, it was in a group in particular that I helped to set up called an International Forum on Globalization, but we were able to get funding so that about 40 of us from around the world studied the process whereby these trade treaties, meaning trade in finance, also finance treaties, were being negotiated around the world. And it was so clear to us that this was about this empire building up of deregulated Monsantos and now we know about BlackRock and so on. But at that time, we're talking about freeing up, Stanley Morgan and the big banks. We were also talking about the BIS, which was and still is the most powerful, biggest bank in the world. And most people had never heard of it. Now there's a little bit of a discussion. It stands for the Bank of International Settlements. See, international settlements, what that bank in Switzerland was doing was essentially giving marching orders to all of the banks that we think of as national banks. But they are actually banks that now our countries belong to. The banks don't belong to our country, just like Mitsubishi doesn't belong to Japan, and Volvo doesn't belong to Sweden, or General Motors to America. But naively, our governments have thought that by supporting their multinationals, they are actually helping their countries. So my experience is that there are a lot of relatively well-intentioned people who have supported this path, because no one was forcing them to sit down and look at the entire system holistically and then to study the impact on society honestly. That wasn't being done. So even as late as, is it now about 5 years ago, the Swedish government passed a law saying trade treaties have to be negotiated in secrecy. And some journalists contacted me saying, no other journalists seem to be talking about this. There's just a few of us. Can you help us? And we did a few things for the web, which of course, it's a big jungle out there, the web.
Yes.
And And then, when I try to understand, and I've had some family members in the banking and even in politics at a high level, and it's so clear that it's this naive thing. Of course, Volvo has trade secrets, so we have to support that. When there are trade negotiations, we need to protect their interest. So that is an important message I have, is that inside many of the giant corporations and in our governments, there is so much blindness that we shouldn't assume that everyone in power knows perfectly well what they're doing. And I would really urge people, instead of focusing on the individuals and demonizing particular individuals, particular parties, or even particular corporations, to try instead in this holistic way to look at the structures and then look strategically at what can we do about it. And the first thing we need to do about it is to get more awareness of what's actually going on.
Well, I agree with you. I think awareness, in my experience, is whether it's a personal issue or a societal issue, awareness is usually the first step to change, recognizing what we're facing. And I think what's important, what you've shared there, and interesting enough, I discussed the same on a podcast with myself last week, where I was interviewed by another podcaster on Thursday. We were talking about the likes of the WEF and these different organizations and individuals. And the difficulty is when we're always placing the problem outside of ourselves, we actually remove our agency to affect it. And I think that's, whilst it's important to have an awareness of the role and function of different organizations, in the same way that you've talked about holistic thinking, to me, it's also about then understanding the root cause, and interestingly, going back to your big picture activism, I've always spoken into the human condition and how we need to evolve our consciousness in order to navigate the next era of this. But it was through your big picture activism that I had this aha moment, because even as you were talking about the algorithms on Facebook, you could say that Facebook is an inert piece of technology, but it's not, because the algorithm, once it may have been at the beginning, but once it's in motion, and they recognize that by creating an algorithm that captures your attention in one way and pits it against someone else, that they keep you addicted. They've worked out how to hijack your neurochemistry effectively. So the technology is no longer inert. So that we have to become aware of that, but which means that we have to not only look at what's causing us to become polarized, we have to look at what's causing us from of missing the big picture, what's causing us to kind of descend into this victim mentality where we remain passive observers, which is why I was so curious about your tipping point of standing up, because at this point, getting to awareness stage before someone actually claims, puts a fork in the ground and says enough's enough, it's hard. Despite we've got the technology in the world, all the technology available at our fingertips. So on one hand, whilst these tools have proliferated the problem, they've also given us part of the solution in the fact that we can have this conversation and actually distribute these conversations, at least in part, because censorship is another issue. But how do we? And the reason I went down that track is because I think it's important to recognize that the systems themselves impact upon our consciousness and the evolution of our consciousness. And I really want to draw upon this before we perhaps look at some of the proposition level or the mechanistic piece. But you spoke earlier on about how we need to shift our consciousness in a unique way. What do you think needs to happen in order for us to elevate our consciousness in the way that you described?
Well, I actually think that is, I said that I think I would recommend to everyone now to try to connect to a few like-minded others. I would urge people everywhere where they can to do that with people who are physically within reach. But if they aren't, I would suggest regular meetings online. But I think it's vital that we move away from the I to a we, so that we're starting to broaden the picture enough so that we're thinking of moving beyond isolated consumer choices. We've been herded in a direction through corporate funding and influence in the environmental movements, in the social movements, and so on, to choose and to be herded into thinking we're going to change the world through our individual shopping choices, basically. So they managed to turn the environmental movement away from thinking of the individuals thinking of themselves as citizens with a vote, because it was very clear in the 60s and 70s that the changes we needed to make required collective action. They required policy change. And so whether it was decentralized renewable energy or more holistic thinking at universities, more holistic, interdisciplinary, honest science, all of that, it was recognized, needed policy change, because what was clear was that we were moving on a path with so-called cheap fossil fuels, driving people off the land, destroying agriculture, actually creating agriculture that was less productive. And I just want to pause a minute there to say that, in our holistic picture in Ancient Futures, in my book, and in Local Futures, my organization, we are, fairly unique still, unfortunately, because our baseline is one that is deeply connected to how we treat the earth, the economy that provides everything that we need. And unfortunately, in the new economy movement, that's relatively rare. People get caught up on the level of technology, including money, which is a technology. They are not examining deeply enough, for instance, to look at agriculture and agriculture, forestry, fishing, all these primary productions that provide food, clothing, shelter. What's happened to those in the modern era is that our governments, including Scandinavia, have subsidized and supported ever greater inefficiency, ever greater waste of resources, ever more toxic pollution, getting less out of each unit of land while employing fewer people. And while they get less out of the land, they're doing it with tools, including chemicals, which are also technology, that poison and pollute the land, the water, and us. So we have our governments, also in Scandinavia, supporting a path of treating the real economy in such a way that we're getting less out of every unit of land and water. In the process, we're poisoning ourselves and the earth, and in the process, we're providing far fewer jobs. In the meanwhile, we have a growing population. We have an overabundance of human beings. And this overabundance is still, 8 billion people. If they were allowed, if we had a human liberation front that allowed those human beings to engage in genuinely productive work, in genuinely meaningful work, we could happily employ all 8 billion in ways that would actually be more enjoyable, more meaningful, at a human pace, at an ecological pace. They would not be trying to, pick the tomatoes when they were green and use gases to try to ripen them artificially. They would not be planting acres of rows of one thing, which is completely unnatural. So the potential for humanity today to go in a different direction is huge, huge, but it requires that type of bigger picture. And when we understand that most of the technological development, including the communication that we're using now, has aided centralized corporate control far more than it's aided us, then I think we would want to agree that we want to use these technologies now for communication. And we ideally need to build a movement that's going to say, we want to pause in terms of other uses. We want these rapid communication technologies and systems that are already in place to be used to really understand what's going on and to deploy them for communication, to share vital information about the impacts of what's going on, about the different possibilities of doing things differently. We want them used in times of crisis, climate change, upheavals, war. Yes, we need fast communication there. But to use these centralized tools for commercial purposes, whether in a gambling casino or for the Monsantos and the BlackRocks of this world, that needs to be stopped, basically. We need to be saying we want to push the pause button on that, and perhaps we'll find that there'll be some businesses that should deploy these technologies, but we want democratic process to shape the direction. I mean, it's to protect the continuation of life, really.
Yes, I see that. I'm interested to explore, having that awareness of the big picture. In many ways, when you define it in the way that you have, the problem becomes quite clear, but the solution becomes there. I think comes with a level of complexity. To reach that point. What's your take on the variety of solutions that are necessary in order to reach those outcomes?
Well, I guess I would say, the first step for anyone who feels enough is enough, I want to examine another way forward. I want to understand better and I want to do something. For anyone like that, I would say, try to get together with a small group. Ideally, my dream for everyone is that people could meet regularly, ideally as often as once a week, and ideally in a group between, say, 12 and 20, maybe up to 25, to collectively examine these issues. So we're talking about reconnection, rethinking, and then resistance and renewal. And the rethink that we ask people to do collectively would share the load of reading, seeing a few films. We provide materials at Local Futures. They could then, as part of the action forward, they would have clarity that there are two distinct paths forward, distinct systemic paths, and that business as usual, continuing in the direction that our governments, without any exception that I know of, governments are following the mainstream formula. And that formula goes back directly to slavery, genocide, colonialism. The formula was, you are not going to be producing for your needs in your region or in your country. You're going to be producing for export. And that's what the central tenet of the modern economy is. So I would rather that people, instead of talking about capitalism, distinguish between this one centralized global economy that was born off the back of slaves and genocide, as I say, with force, that then created a playing field for global traders where they, to this day, have kept the value of currency low in some countries and the value is higher elsewhere. So you have this perfect flow of production over here, selling over here, where labor is being paid more. Now, who decides how much people earn per hour? What does that mean? What does GDP mean? There are only a few basic truths that people need to learn about the economy to realize how insane it is that we all go along with our governments using GDP, that we all go along with how they use taxes, subsidies, and regulations. Regulations meaning laws and the treaties through the trade treaties, but also the way that at the local level, we're paying taxes to be policed. If we want to build a new room in our house, if we want to build a staircase, someone comes and says, no, those are 2 inches too high. Oh, no, you're not allowed to do that. And you can't do this and you can't do that. And in the meanwhile, our governments are telling big business, you can destroy the climate. You can build biological warfare labs. You can, in the name of health and progress, you're allowed to poison and pillage and steal. It's mad. But when you, and then when you realize that GDP literally goes up with illness, with crime, with environmental breakdown, there, I just hope that people will be interested in saying, wow, you know, this is like an opportunity to understand why everything is going so wrong, and why, particularly since the mid 80s, 90s, you know, in these last 30, 35 years, when you chart what's been happening and the crisis escalating, when you see how emissions continue to rise, and when you learn that the carbon is a clever way of trading to make global corporations richer, when we're told to go around monitoring and measuring carbon because it's supposed to be good for the climate, you know, when you wake up to some of these basics, it's very helpful. So I really, yeah, I believe the first step, the connection with others, and then the rethinking. After that, the action of understanding what we need to resist and what we need to renew becomes clearer. But I would like to just say that the renewal part is about the reconnection and the rebuilding of a fabric that I would argue is a fabric that's required for us to become human again, to become who we really are. Because who we really are from the age of a few months, let's say, even, no, you know, in the womb even, but who we are is that we need love. We need to be loved and cared for. We long to be loved. We long to be seen and heard and appreciated, because we are social beings, because we cannot survive without community. We can't survive, as they discovered even with experiments with monkeys. If baby monkeys were not held, they withered away and died.
Mm-hmm.
And so these children that are born into the world, they need to be carried, they need to be cared for. And as we have created a system, and I say we, I really shouldn't say we, because it's a system that most of us did not create. It actually started, you know, with a few traders and a few big thinkers that ended up imposing ideas and practices on the world. So part of this humanity that we can regain relatively quickly, I say part, I mean, is a deeper connection to others. And that's why I just so hope that people who are listening will think about this profound need that we have, whether we recognize it or not, for connection, and be willing to connect with a group of people for that deeper sharing and caring and vulnerability of being able to say, this is who I am, this is what I care about, and these are my hang-ups and problems. I am not perfect. I am this, I am that. Can we still look at each other in the eye and see that we care about each other? Now, 12-step programs have for a long time proven that the worst addictions to drugs and alcohol can be cured in that way. And the fundamental principle is that community building. Now, in our situation, if we can see that part of the way forward is that deep connection, and we do that as part of our path to essentially build a world where we can live in deeper connection. But, you know, the building of that world and what we need to resist and how we resist it, you know, which media we use, which technologies we use, and the path of the renewal, which I could say more about, exactly what that consists of. First of all, the localizing path that we're encouraging is a path that respects diversity. And that means it's a path that is turning towards life instead of away from life. Life is infinite diversity, infinite complexity. And that is so rich when we get closer to it. And that we're turning towards the real wealth, the real richness, the real excitement, the real adventure, the real incredible opportunity for creativity, and particularly, you know, in community. So, Yeah, and I should let you speak a bit. I'm sorry.
Well, no, this is really fascinating. So there's a couple of things I would like to spin off from here. So in the renewal space or the rethinking space, even if you're within small groups, something I've witnessed now, and it's particularly off the back of the pandemic and going into this situation of Ukraine and Russia, and then prior to that in Europe, for those of us in the United Kingdom, there was a lot of polarization around Brexit. But we've bounced from one big picture story to another, big news story to another, rather, and I think it's having a very strong adverse effect upon people's psyche. And whilst there's some fantastic green shoots activity in terms of localization that I've witnessed in the United Kingdom, a lot of it's very beautiful and a lot of it's very powerful. I also see some of the things that done out of fear and scarcity. And my concern is, and fear is contagious, we've seen that. If you're coming together in communities, one of the beautiful things, I've never been part of a 12-step program, but I'm familiar with the steps. I've studied them. I've got friends who have been part of those various different programs that use those methodologies. One of the key elements is that they're supported and guided through that journey with mentors and sponsors. My concern at the moment, particularly under the fragile environment that we live under right now, is that fear can become all-encompassing. And it's fascinating to witness within a circle how quickly someone's mindset can be shattered by one person's depth of fear. So I wonder, and my concern with that is that if we build the future or we start to reimagine the future out of fear and scarcity, I don't think it will take too long before we find ourselves following the same path that we've just trodden, just in a slightly different way. What's your take on that? And how can we come to that place of, and I think the spiritual piece to me is one of the most important pieces, coming to that centeredness, peaceful, loving, peace within and love within, in order to have that kind of feet on the ground ability to be able to see things as they are, not worse than they are, in order to kind of be calm and serene in our action. Whereas that fear drives us into fight and flight. And I'm very concerned from witnessing some of the really positive things that could potentially end up negative by virtue of the energy that they're being created from.
Yeah, I think it's very, very tricky. I actually, a long, long time ago, ended up talking about the need for what I call creative schizophrenia, because I found that as people were discovering this more spiritual path, they became convinced that if we look at the destruction in the eye, if we talk about it, we give it power. And they're only advocating, peaceful, positive, loving messages, nothing else. And as far as I'm concerned, it's become very clear that that's not productive, it's not true, it's not right. But equally, I've seen activists who have been acting out of fear, out of anger, paying no attention to both it's from my point of view, and also from these amazing people I lived with, the spiritual side of it isn't just me alone and what I do, whether I meditate or not. The spiritual side of it is that deeper connection to others and the deeper connection to life, the deeper connection to, maybe it's gardening, maybe it's that horse that you love, or those dogs, or your passion for wilderness, your connection to nature, to life, that reconnection to others and to life furthers and helps that inner connection, because the inner connection that's needed is the reconnection between the two brain halves, for one thing, where the lefts become too dominant, the connection between that and the heart and the gut and down to the toes. It's about an embodied, deep reconnection. Now, I would just urge people to, first of all, spell that out to everyone. Don't think this is all just about the activism, including the anger and the anti, without a vision of what it is we love and what it is we want, where we want to be going. That should be preeminent, but not exclusive, because we're going to have greater clarity about what we want when we know clearly what we don't want. And I'm talking now also about feeling for many years in my work that it was so difficult because I was dealing with these two invisible realities. I was dealing on the one hand with the furthest, most remote economic policy at the global level, which was invisible. People didn't even know about the trade treaties. They had no idea what they actually meant. And then I was on the other side, I was talking about our inner well-being, what it is that really provides joy and deep happiness and a sense of peace and wholeness and health in us. And both of these are invisible. And it's that connection between those remote, opposite, as it were, sides of the spectrum that we're bringing together in the big picture. When you do, you do need to be willing to take a deep breath and to look at the fact that our governments, having ended up on this path for, remember, historical reasons that go back, and I still find it hard sometimes not to get frustrated with some of my environmentalist and social activist friends for instance, ignoring the economic dimension when, they've heard what GDP means. But anyway, it's sort of, once you see what this has led to, and you now look at algorithms and their role, and you look at the fact that this mega technological path is linked to expanding resource consumption exponentially and very, really rapidly, and fighting over resources on Mars, the deepest seabed, in Ukraine. What's been unleashed is this algorithmic appetite to chew up every last bit of the earth and then go off to Mars as well. It's also what's been unleashed was how the corporate banking and other corporate systems from the US mainly, but the Western ones, they created a Chinese consumer culture. They created a corporate structure in China to create this consumer culture, which has now become linked to an autocratic government and to a lot of blindness around ecological limits and the problems with toxic chemicals. It's a very frightening combination. So when you look at that, it wouldn't be very intelligent not to be frightened. And I don't think we should fear, but I think once we understand that when we put on the lenses that we're talking about in local futures, when we put on these new lenses and we suddenly start examining things through different media, a different way, searching out the more grassroots, if you like, or let's say the information and the examples and the people that have not been funded by this top-down system, and that have not only not been funded, they've actually been blocked by this system. They've been oppressed by this system. And everywhere you look, sprouting up is evidence, first of all, that people desperately want something else. Evidence, as far as I'm concerned, I've spoken to enough taxi drivers in London and New York. I've been, working closely in 12 countries and working, with 80 countries for our World Localization Day. The evidence everywhere is that people want something else, and that 99% of humanity, for sure, would not be going along with this if they were informed. They don't want to subsidize old toxic food from the other side of the world. They don't want to subsidize adverts that target their 3-year-old children to become addicted to the screen. They don't want to subsidize a path that's destroying virtually every small farm, every small town, every smaller city. Everything has to merge to become bigger and bigger. People don't want that, and they are demonstrating that in countless ways. So once you start opening your eyes, and really, honestly and truly, I am amazed by how much is going on at the grassroots, really amazed, because it's happening without any help. and it's happening under these conditions of constant pressure and oppression and regulations and laws that work against it. So I think there's so much to celebrate. There's so much to be incredibly joyful about, and so much to want to connect to build up that sense of strength and power. And this is, again, the paradox of our work in local futures is we're promoting localization from a global perspective, a lot of global experience, from a global network of connection, and we're promoting it globally. And it's a bit insane. I should say anyone who wants to support us financially would be very grateful, because it's a bit mad how much we've taken on with such a small organization. But really, the main thing we're trying to do is to get this information and this vision out and hope that it'll be carried, by many more. So, yeah, don't be afraid of the fear, and when I say fear, I do feel, I like to sort of remind people that anger is really counterproductive. Usually anger eats away at us. And I suppose the fear that you're talking about is also a fear that can immobilize and that can be literally harmful for our bodies. So, no, not that kind of fear. Maybe we call it concern. Maybe we call it
Yes.
being willing to look at the darkness with honest, open eyes, being willing to look at that, but not letting it eat away at us, because we bathe in the light and the knowing that it's not humanity that's the problem. It's not innate human greed. It's not nature. It's not any form of life that's the problem. It's an anti-human patriarchal system started by a few people and today actively promoted by very few people. And that's the crazy thing, if we allow this tiny group that are actively still promoting the systemic direction to, rob us of life and rob us of meaning, this is why we must understand better how the system really works.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that the piece on anger and fear, the important thing I think is that we don't suppress those feelings, that we embrace them, because they're sending us a message. That the anger is a response or a reaction to something. So is the fear, and it's how we transmute that into something positive. Because I always say that if we act out of anger, I call it the boomerang effect. We're throwing more anger out into the world, and we'll probably get smacked back in the head with more anger, which just becomes self-perpetuating. It's to me, it's about how we transmute it into something positive. And similarly with the fear, for instance, now with the impact on the global supply chains, people talking about the possibility of running out of food, and as such, looking to produce their own food. The intention is positive, the fact that they want to now produce their own food. But if it's out of the idea that we will run out, at the seed of that is a scarcity. Whereas if it comes from it's the right thing to do for bigger picture reasons, for systemic change, also for the joy de vivre of actually doing it, for the love of the craft, I think that, it might sound esoteric, but you're putting the love into the soil when you're growing a food. You're not putting the fear of running out into the soil, because that to me is also, it's rather than a boomerang effect, it's self-perpetuating. It's the psyche that we place into it. And I think if you look at those small number of people who are perpetuating the system, you can pretty be sure that they are being guided by fear and scarcity at some level, or trauma.
Absolutely. It's my experience. And I've met scientists who were geneticists and who were busily working away to create genetically modified food, which people should know that the billions in the beginning were all focused on how do we create food, vegetables, that can tolerate more pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. The genetic manipulation was how can we create a plant that will tolerate even more of this stuff, which we know is toxic for our health. And yet these scientists were doing it with The absolute message they've been given, which we must do this to grow enough food for the global population. It's unfortunate, maybe some fungus, but we have to do this to grow. They never had any of the training in a deeper eco-literacy. And what I was saying earlier about small, diversified, organic farms can produce more than 5 times as much per unit of land than any monoculture will ever be able to do. This is a foundational truth that people really need to, again, digest and reflect on, understand that this whole view of scarcity, this whole tower of exploitation that keeps people running in fear and believing on a crowded planet we've got to do this. Destroy more jobs, render people more and more useless and doing more and more meaningless tasks while we hand over the production to more, using more and more energy, more and more minerals, chewing up more of the earth, polluting more. It's, there's certain clear truths about these paths that we really need to know about. And the
Thank you.
shortening of distances in localization, of trying to link up production with consumption as much as possible without any kind of absolute, I've helped to start countless farmers markets around the world. And sometimes people would say to me, oh yeah, Helena, we're only allowing farmers that come from half an hour drive outside of Boulder or wherever it was. And I say, no. With a bigger picture, it's about shortening distances, creating vibrant markets, but don't think of it as an absolute. Because the end goal, we still don't know quite what it would be. It would be different in different places, depending on the resources, depending on the cultures. And that's, again, to put it simply, the two paths. The one that I believe that most people without a doubt would support is the one that reconnects with life, that comprehends that this is where we get our nourishment, our physical nourishment, our spiritual nourishment. We have to reconnect with that, respect it, support it. And the other one is one that has become removed from life and is linked to creating profit for fewer and fewer people, fewer and fewer corporations, and with it all that toxicity, all that pollution, all that ill health, all that divisiveness, the war machine. Yeah, so turning in the direction of local, it really is the whole concept does have the potential to change the world.
Thank you, Helena. In closing, I think that we've had a really inspiring conversation. We set out with the goal to help raise people's awareness through this conversation. I think we've done an outstanding job of really doing that and inspiring the idea of taking that holistic, big picture view, the importance of our spiritual path, and then reconnecting to ourselves and those around us. Could you close by telling us a little bit about the World Localization Day that's coming up later this year, and also a little bit about what people can find when they visit localfutures.org for the kind of resources, the extensive resources that you put together?
Oh, thank you very much. The kind of thing I don't do enough of. Yeah, World Localization Day, we launched 3 years ago at the beginning of COVID, or listen now, 2.5 years maybe, when we realized that we were doing these regional conferences around the world as a way of getting people together in the area to exchange ideas and to start jointly making that turning towards life. And we had plans to work with the new Mexican government, with the Minister for the Environment there. Every year for now 7-8 years, we've done one in South Korea. And we're still continuing with that now, but more online in Japan. And we're working with a group that's working with lots of favelas in Rio. Anyway, all around the world. And now suddenly with COVID, we couldn't put on these conferences. So we launched the idea of celebrating and strengthening and doing what we could to network all these amazing efforts that are going on around the world. So it's a celebration of countless. I mean, we're doing a lot trying to identify things, but the good news is that there's so much that you can't even begin to document it. So we're just touching here and there, but even that becomes so incredibly inspiring. So World Localization Day, we decided to name June 21st, which is summer solstice, which in Sweden especially is a very big, celebration in nature, people outside, and that's the actual day. But we have a build up to that. So most of the month of June, things will be going on around the world. So please tune into our website, localfuture.org, and then you'll also be led on to the World Localization Day website. Just now, the actual website is being redone, but there'll be pages on our website. And yeah, you can also perhaps organize an event, and we might be able to promote it as part of the celebrations. You'll be able to hear from people from around the world. You can join also our IAL, which is the International Alliance for Localization, that we have members from around the world. And you'll find more of that information on our website. You'll also find an amazing archive, which we have to package in a bit differently, because it's so much information, because we've been doing this well, I've been doing it for 45 years, as we said. So we have a lot, anyone who'd want to do a PhD on localization should come to our website, because once you start delving, you'll find articles, you'll find voices from around the world. You'll find also that we've recorded conversations with people like Russell Brand, who quoted me quite a lot in his book, Revolution. And I've also done some other things with him, and he supported World Localization Day. Gabor Mate, this past year, Charles Eisenstein, Jane Goodall, Brian Eno, some people, with quite big names have been supporting this. It's interesting because some other people with big names, I obviously won't name them, were very interested and supportive, but they were very nervous. They were afraid that somehow this was going to be perceived as either too right-wing or too left-wing. The truth is, this transcends left and right. And what's so wonderful too is that it transcends the caring for yourself versus the caring for others. It transcends, the inner and the outer divide. It transcends also keeping ecological issues separate from human welfare issues. So it's really, it's a very, very, very healing message and view once you get your head around it. Yeah, so World Localization Day and our website, localfutures.org. My book, Ancient Futures, that outlines how I came to see these things in this way by being embedded in an indigenous ancient culture, and then seeing all these changes coming in from the global economy, that are changes that are still coming into England, still coming into every country. So it lends a lot of clarity. And then I also have a newer book called Local is Our Future, which lays out the basics of localization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll add that one of my favorite sections on the Local Futures website is the Action Resources section. It's got an incredible local action guide, localization action guide, where you can look at how you can get involved on a local basis. It's got a whole map of alternatives in terms of different organizations and different entities that are seeking to do different work in different parts of the world. It's got a whole range of independent media sources. So it's a fantastic compilation of resources, and I recommend that you check those pieces out, and the books that Helena's recommended. There is a whole world of material to help us embark upon these ideas with the simple concepts that we talked about today in order to change the world. So I want to firstly thank you for your time with us here this evening. I know you've had a long day, and it's a beautiful conversation at such an important time in history. I feel like the world is looking for solutions. We're witnessing the problems, and between us, the diversity of humankind, I believe, will find a way to carve a different path, though, and you're helping very much to pioneer that path. So thank you so much, for your work, but also for being with us here today.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and hope we'll stay in touch and collaborate. By the way, we want to have sort of media collaboration for WLD or for World Localization Day, so maybe you can do something in June. That would be great.
I'd love to talk to you about that, absolutely. And for those of us who have watched live today or in the replay, please join us inside the Elevate Network, where we are continuing the conversation about what we've discussed here. If you're not familiar with the Elevate Network, it's our platform for change. And we've also got a Building Resilient Communities segment within our overall platform, where you can become connected with the types of work that we're doing here, and very much would absolutely like to support World Localization Day within our network. So thank you so much, Helena, and thank you so much to our wonderful audience.
Thank you. Bye-bye.